On August 24th, 2011, Marc Despain had ice cream for lunch with his wife. He came home that afternoon the same way he always did, through the front door, into the kitchen, setting his groceries down on the table. He had no reason to believe that day would be his last. Less than 2 hours later, Marc Despain was on the floor of that same kitchen, shot once through the chest and a second time, point blank, between the eyes. His wife Michelle made the call, screaming into the phone, barely coherent, telling the operator her husband was dead and she was afraid for her own life. Before August 24th, 2011, Marc Evan Despain was the kind of man people in Jonesboro, Arkansas described without hesitation. Hard-working, ambitious, someone who walked into a room and made it feel bigger. His mother, Tana, would later say that Marc never met a stranger, that wherever he went, people were drawn to him, that he had a way of making everyone around him feel like they mattered. He was 34 years old, and by every measure his life was exactly what he had worked for. Marc grew up inside the real estate business. His parents, Jack and Tana, built their careers in property, and Marc learned the trade from the ground up, working alongside them before eventually striking out on his own. He became a licensed appraiser. He started investing in properties. He ran his business from the home he shared with his family in the Lehman Crest neighborhood, one of the more exclusive areas of Jonesboro, a house with a pool, a neighborhood where people cut their grass on Saturdays and left their doors unlocked. He had built that life deliberately, and at the center of it was Michelle, his high school sweetheart, the woman he had chosen before he had anything to offer and built everything alongside. Together they were raising 2 young sons. Marc had also stepped into the role of stepfather to Michelle's teenage daughter from a previous relationship, without hesitation, without condition. To the people who knew him, Marc Despain was not complicated. He was a man who loved his children, took pride in his work, and believed that effort was its own reward. But inside that house, behind the comfortable life and the growing portfolio and the family dinners, the foundation had already begun to give way. Marc's business was under pressure. Money that should have been there was missing, and the person handling the finances was Michelle. There were also cracks in the marriage itself. Quietly, slowly, the kind that don't announce themselves all at once, but accumulate over years, until one day the weight becomes impossible to ignore. Marc was not a man who had enemies in the street. The threat to his life was never going to come from a stranger. It was already living inside his home. Every family has a version of itself that it shows to the world. The Despains were no different. From the outside, they were a success story. A young couple who had built something real together. A husband who worked hard. A wife who held a job at the bank, managed the household, raised 3 children. A life that looked, by every visible measure, like exactly what it was supposed to be. But investigators would discover that the life Marc Despain believed he was living was not entirely the life that existed. Then there was Carl Kelly, Michelle's father. Carl was a constant presence in Marc and Michelle's world, involved in their affairs, embedded in their business dealings, showing up when he was needed and sometimes when he wasn't. On the surface, he was just a father-in-law playing the role families expect. But as the investigation deepened, Carl Kelly would emerge as something far more consequential. And on the other side of the family stood Jack Despain, Marc's own father. The relationship between Marc and Jack had not been a simple one for years. It had deteriorated. A serious allegation had surfaced, a claim that inappropriate photographs of Michelle's teenage daughter had been found on Jack's phone. The accusation shattered whatever remained between them. Though investigators would later determine the girl had taken the photos herself, the damage was already done. Marc and his father had not spoken properly in years. By the summer of 2011, Marc Despain's marriage was not the marriage anyone on the outside believed it to be. The business he had spent years building was hemorrhaging money, and the records told a specific story, one that pointed directly at Michelle. She had access to the accounts, she understood the books, and funds had been moved in ways that were difficult to explain and impossible to ignore. Marc had confronted her, more than once. According to people close to the family, the confrontations had grown sharper in the months leading up to August, the kind of conversations that leave no room for repair. Marc was beginning to understand the full scope of what had been taken from him, and by whom. But the financial betrayal was only part of it. Michelle was also involved with another man, a younger co-worker, a relationship she had not disclosed and had no intention of disclosing. Investigators would later confirm the affair was ongoing at the time of Marc's death, and that it represented not just a personal betrayal, but a motive. Because if Marc walked away from the marriage, the money would be exposed. The affair would surface. The life Michelle had constructed, On Marc's name, Marc's credit, Marc's business would unravel completely. And Michelle was not the only one with something to lose. Carl Kelly, her father, was embedded in their financial dealings. Whatever Marc knew, whatever Marc intended to do about it, put Carl's exposure at risk as well. What prosecutors would eventually argue was this: the decision to kill Marc Despain was not made in a moment of rage. It was not an impulse. It was a calculation. Conversations had taken place between Michelle, between Carl, and eventually with others, long before August 24th arrived. The plan had been discussed, tested, refined. A name had been identified. A price had been set. Terrence Barker, a man connected to Johnny Hubbard, one of Marc's own tenants, a man who could be reached, approached, and paid. Marc Despain did not know any of this. August 24th, 2011, began the way most days did for Marc Despain. He woke up, he worked, and sometime in the early afternoon, he sat down to lunch with his wife. Whatever was wrong between them, the missing money, the unanswered questions, the weight of a marriage coming apart at the seams, none of it was visible that afternoon. They sat across from each other. They ate. They talked. To anyone watching, it would have looked completely ordinary. That lunch was the last time Marc Despain was seen alive by anyone who knew him. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, Michelle returned to work. Marc headed home. Marc pulled into the driveway of his home on Jenny Lane sometime after that lunch. He walked inside. He set the ice cream he had picked up on the kitchen table. What happened next took only seconds. Marc Despain was shot once in the chest. He went down. And then, at close range, point blank, a second shot was fired directly between his eyes. Investigators would later describe it without hesitation. Execution style. Marc did not survive either shot. He was 34 years old, and he died on the floor of his own kitchen, next to the groceries he had just carried through the front door. Then the staging began. Barker moved through the house with deliberate intention. Drawers were pulled open, cabinets disturbed, items scattered across the floor to create the impression of a search, a burglar moving fast through a house, looking for valuables, panicking. But the staging failed at its most basic level. The things a burglar would have taken, electronics, jewelry, items of obvious value, were untouched, sitting exactly where Marc had left them. And on the kitchen table, Marc's cell phone sat beside the melting container of ice cream. A real burglar would have taken the phone. A real burglar would not have left it there. When Michelle Despain arrived home that afternoon, she called 911. Her voice fractured on the recording. She told the dispatcher her husband was dead, that she was terrified, that she didn't know what had happened. Officers responded within minutes, and Detective Vic Brooks walked into that kitchen and looked at a scene that had been constructed for him to believe, and didn't, because nothing in that room told the story it was supposed to tell. The ice cream was still melting, the phone was still on the table, and Marc Despain, a man with no enemies in the street, was lying dead on his kitchen floor. Brooks looked at all of it, and he started asking questions. Detective Vic Brooks did not close the case in a day. He built it the way good investigators always do. Carefully, methodically, one question at a time, letting the evidence tell him where to look next, instead of deciding first what he wanted to find. And what the evidence told him, almost immediately, was that nothing about this crime scene was what it claimed to be. The burglary theory died fast. Not because Brooks dismissed it, he followed it far enough to let it collapse on its own weight, because the questions it couldn't answer were too large to ignore. The crime scene itself raised the second flag. The disturbance throughout the house was staged. Brooks could feel it before he could prove it. The drawers pulled open too evenly. The items scattered without the chaos of real desperation. It had the quality of a set piece, something arranged to be looked at, not something left behind in a panic. Then came the third signal, and this one Brooks did not expect to come from the family. In the hours after Marc's body was found, before investigators had formed a single theory, before they had asked a single hard question, Michelle Despain and Carl Kelly were already answering one. They wanted Brooks to look at Jack Despain, Marc's estranged father, the man Marc had cut off years earlier over the allegation involving Michelle's daughter. Carl was loud about it, insistent. Michelle echoed it, both of them steering the investigation toward Jack with a certainty that didn't fit grief. Brooks filed it. He had seen this before. People who point fingers that fast are almost never pointing at the truth. Phone records came next. Investigators pulled the communications surrounding the murder, calls, texts, the digital trail that every conspiracy eventually leaves behind. And what they found were connections between Michelle, between Carl, between Johnny Hubbard, a name that did not yet mean anything, and a number that would eventually lead to Terrence Barker. The calls had been made, the timeline held together. Then came the tip that broke the case open. Someone, a source Brooks would not publicly identify, reached out to investigators with a name, Terrence Barker, and a claim that Barker had been talking, telling people what he had done, describing it in enough detail that the source knew he had been inside that house. Barker's cell phone records placed him in the area around the time of the murder. When investigators brought him in, he confirmed what the evidence had already suggested. He had been paid to kill Marc Despain. And when Barker gave up the name of the man who had arranged the introduction, Johnny Hubbard, and Hubbard gave up the name of the man who had made the deal, Carl Kelly, the conspiracy that had been constructed to look like a burglary finished collapsing entirely. It was no longer about Jack Despain. It had never been about Jack Despain. It was about the woman who had lunch with Marc that afternoon, and the father who had been screaming his name on that front lawn from the very first hour. In the months that followed Marc Despain's death, the Craighead County justice system moved through the conspiracy the way the investigation had, one name at a time. Terrence Barker was the first to face formal accountability. The man who had walked into Marc's house on August 24th and pulled the trigger, twice, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 35 years in the Arkansas Department of Correction. He would not be walking out of a prison cell as a young man. Carl Kelly, the man who had stood on that front lawn and pointed his finger at an innocent man while the body of his son-in-law was still inside the house, also pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. 35 years. The sentence matched the act. Carl had not simply failed to stop what happened to Marc. He had helped build it. He had made the calls. He had arranged the chain that ended with 2 bullets and a staged kitchen and a family destroyed. Johnny Hubbard, Marc's own tenant, the man who had provided the connection between the conspiracy and the man willing to carry it out, pleaded guilty to hindering apprehension and received a substantial prison sentence in exchange for his cooperation with investigators. And then there was Michelle Despain, the woman who had shared Marc's bed, raised his children, sat across from him at lunch on the last afternoon of his life, pleaded guilty to 3 counts of hindering apprehension. Prosecutors had pursued capital murder charges. They could not build the case beyond the conspiracy evidence they had. She ultimately accepted the plea and was sentenced to 30 years. She served 5. Michelle Despain was paroled after 5 years in prison. For Jack and Tana Despain, Marc's parents, the people who had built the business he had grown up inside, who had raised the man everyone in Jonesboro described as someone who never met a stranger, no number attached to a sentence changes what August 24th took from them. Their son went home with ice cream. He never came back out. The convictions gave them answers. They gave them the names of the people responsible and the formal acknowledgement of what those people had done. They gave them a record, a public, permanent record, that Marc Despain did not die in a burglary. He was murdered, deliberately, by people he trusted, for money, and for the freedom to continue living a life they had already been stealing from him. That record exists now, and Marc's name is attached to the truth of what happened, not to the story that was built to bury it. What happened to Marc Despain was not random. It was not the result of a stranger's desperation or a crime of opportunity. It was not a burglary. It was not a moment that got out of hand. It was a decision, made by people he had welcomed into his life, his home, his business. People who sat across from him at dinner tables, who knew the names of his children, who understood exactly how much he had built, and decided that what he had built was worth more to them without him in it. That is the particular cruelty of what was done to Marc Despain. He was not taken by the world at large. He was taken by the people he had every reason to trust. In the years since August 24, 2011, the people who loved Marc have done what people who love someone always have to figure out how to do. They have found a way to hold the grief and still move through the days. Jack and Tana Despain, Marc's parents, channeled that grief into something tangible. They helped establish Marc's Place, a resource center in his name, built to support families of violent crime victims. People walking into the worst days of their lives, the way the Despains once did, now have somewhere to go. That is the mark Marc left on his community after he was gone. A door left open for people who have nowhere else to turn. His sons grew up. They grew up knowing who their father was, not from memory, but from the testimony of everyone who knew him. A man who worked hard, who never met a stranger, who brought ice cream home on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon because that was the kind of man he was. The headlines that followed his death were about a murder-for-hire plot. about a wife, about a father-in-law, about a conspiracy that stretched from a kitchen floor to a courtroom. But Marc Despain was not a headline. He was a father, a son, a businessman with plans still on the table and children still growing, and a future he had every reason to expect. The people who took that from him answered for it, some of them more fully than others. What remains, after the courtrooms and the sentences and the years that have passed, is the life that was interrupted, and the name that outlasted everything that was done to end it.